What we're really hoping for is real change, to live a dignified, humane life. Change!
Why do we have military planes on top of us? I'm a doctor, and I've extracted from people life.
Children as young as 9 years of age were victims of killing and maiming, detention, torture, arbitrary arrest, and were used as human shields.
They kill our kids! They kill our boys!
Would you be ready to stand down as president if this could bring peace to your country and stop the bloodshed?
The president shouldn't run away from challenge, and we have national challenge now.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Robin Shepherd. I'm Director of International Affairs at the Henry Jackson Society, a London-based think tank, and also at the Central European Policy Institute. I'm a senior fellow in Slovakia. I'm also a friend and collaborator of the Halifax Forum over the last 4 years, and I'll be emceeing some of the events today. Just before I introduce Kevin Newman from CTV News, who's going to be moderating the session today, obviously everybody here looking at a panel on Syria, terror, the Middle East tragedy and so on is aware of events in Gaza. I want to let you know that this afternoon we'll be having a specific event on Gaza. We'll be shifting the furniture around, so the so-called Halifax chat will be a discussion on that very subject. So just to let you know that there are other opportunities to talk about Gaza, and now I'm going to hand over to Kevin.
Well, thanks very much. You know, when you organize a conference like this, you hope that the first session on the first day is timely. Boy, did they guess right. We have, I'm a news anchor here in Canada, so if you weren't able to catch the headlines this morning on any number of range of issues, here they are. Israel bombarded the Gaza Strip with more than 180 airstrikes today. King Abdullah of Jordan has canceled a visit to Britain out of the protests there. The New York Times has more reporting on the Pentagon saying it could take 75,000 troops to secure Syria's chemical weapons should Assad lose control in Syria or Hezbollah try to obtain them. So I can't, and you guys are the experts, but I can't remember a time of more moving parts in the Middle East puzzle than right now on this day. So much is new, and they're all, of course, interconnected. Hamas is testing Israel. Israel is testing Egypt. There's more uncertainty than ever about Syria, its relationship with Iran, whether it can hold Lebanon together. What is Hezbollah doing now that its backers are involved in their own fights inside Syria? The evolving role of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, the opportunity for Turkey to be playing a role right now, it just is enormous. And I think out of everything that this security conference discusses, this is probably the least secure discussion there is. I'm reminded of Bob Dylan's favorite song, Along the Watchtower. And I propose that we adopt it as our anthem this morning. There must be some way out of here. So let's aim for some relief and maybe a little less confusion. And I'd like to propose the following format just for the beginning of this panel. And then I think I want to open it up to a lot of questions from the floor, because I'm sure there are a lot of questions swimming in your head. I'd like to propose that our panelists first talk about the flow of the situation right now, especially in Syria. The what-if scenarios we'll spend a little bit of time on, and then their recommendations and context and perspective on greater security in the region and what steps might be taken in Syria in particular. And the people that we have on our panel today are close to the street. They have their ear on the ground. In their constituencies, they are people whose opinions are sought and whose opinions are listened to. I'd like to introduce Ms. Afra Jalabi. She's a Arab-Canadian journalist, has written for 12 years for Saudi's leading independent daily. She's also a member of the Syrian National Council, formed in opposition to Bashar al-Assad. She holds a bachelor's degree. She's Canadian in anthropology, a poli-sci degree from McGill, a journalism degree from Carleton, and she's working on her PhD at Concordia right now. Cengiz Çandar is very well known in Turkey. He's a very popular columnist for the Radikal Daily in Istanbul. He has lectured at Bilgi University in Istanbul, studied at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, also served as a special advisor to Turkish President Turgut Özal in the early 90s. Rahide Durgam is a columnist and senior diplomatic correspondent for the leading independent Arabic daily Al Hayya. She was named one of the 100 most powerful Arab women last year. Appears on U.S. cable news channels quite often, and is the founder and executive chairman of the independent think tank Beirut Institute. Safin Dizai is a leadership member in the Kurdistan Democratic Party. He was recently the Minister of Education in the Kurdistan province of northern Iraq. He's also a member, was a standing-in member of the Iraqi Governing Council under U.S. authority in 2004. Interesting family history. He was exiled to the UK and has returned to his homeland and is playing a very key role in its development in the Kurdistan province. So let's start big. Let's make this a conversation. Let's have more Oprah, fewer speeches. And hopefully everybody here will get involved shortly. So I'd like to begin by asking all of our panelists to take a bird's eye view first. How you see the flow happening in the region generally, in Syria in particular, and where do you see some connections happening? Afra, would you like to begin?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm replacing my colleague from the Syrian National Council, Ridwan Ziadeh. I was slightly surprised that he chose me because he knows that I'm in the nonviolence movement in Syria, and I'm doing my PhD on the nonviolent movement in Syria. So it's quite a privilege to be hearing your perspective, and I think it would be interesting for you to hear my perspective. I'm almost tempted to do the title now of my PhD as the successful failure of nonviolence in Syria. Because if some of you followed the events, the first 6 months were markedly nonviolent, and that didn't happen by chance or coincidence. There was a great deal of planning and consciousness behind it. However, Syria has been isolated for a long time from the international community. There was not enough awareness about the effectiveness of nonviolence. People felt with the brutality of the regime that they have to engage in what they called self-defense, and they started calling for a no-fly zone. And so the later slogans in the demonstrations in Syria started asking for international intervention. It was around this time the Syrian National Council was formed, whose mandate was to actually bring help to defend the civilians who were protesting. The reasons, the main reason the Syrians did not want to back up has to do with what happened to them in the 80s, when the Syrian regime brutally crushed the rebellion, especially which was centered in the city of Hama, and killed, according to the claims of the regime, 38,000 people in a 27-day campaign in the month of February in 1982. So the Syrian people felt that if they back off, they would be severely punished, because in the 80s, after 82, the next 10 following years, the government, the regime, punished the Syrians collectively. There were about 80,000 forcibly disappeared people whose files are still not closed, and thousands of prisoners of conscience. So the Syrians felt that they have to continue at any cost. And when international help didn't come, the idea of defense started forming in the movement itself. And so those soldiers who were defecting from the army started creating small groups to defend, in fact, initially what they called the peacefulness of the revolution. And so they started going around buildings, because that's where snipers used to shoot at peaceful protesters. But as one author once said, defense is the first act of war. So what happened is that in order to achieve this defense of civilians, these small groups, which increasingly also became joined by civilians who took up arms to defend their towns and families and suburbs, started actually engaging in more proactive approaches, and they started taking checkpoints and even certain neighborhoods and some towns and some villages, which they started calling liberated areas. However, even when they succeeded in liberating these areas, especially as we see now in the north, they could not protect themselves in the air. The regime still held air power, and the regime started shelling people, including the use of barrel bombs, which could go through several story buildings all the way to the basement. And so, of course, the casualty rate rose tremendously. And again, the Syrians found themselves defenseless and at the moment feel quite abandoned. However, the recent developments in Doha where we tried to bring a more inclusive coalition of the Syrian opposition, is becoming a hopeful point for Syrians that the armed struggle, if it goes under civilian leadership, it would lead to better results if there will not be international intervention and no-fly zone. So this is the real fear of Syrians. I talked to some of them yesterday to get to their perspective, people who are inside Syria, some activists. And the message they wanted to bring to all of you is that the democracy movement, the pro-human rights movement, feel abandoned, not just for the last 2 years, but for the last few decades, and that all of us have come to this point where in the West there's vulnerable security, and the Arab world, there's almost an imploding of civil society. Thank you.
So let me just do a quick follow-up then. The Doha development last week, how is that, what is the best way that your contacts in Syria say it can be given, first of all, weight, and secondly, assurances that it doesn't contain radical elements that might take advantage of the situation?
Well, from people in the opposition and people on the ground, they feel that this coalition has to be given a chance because it's perhaps at the moment the strongest viable option to contain the armed struggle in Syria and to give it a civilian leadership. And because the figures chosen, Muaz al-Khatib, who's a moderate reformer, he's an engineer by training, but also comes from a long line of Islamic scholars who espouse moderate ideas, progressive ideas, including feminist ideas. And then you have Riyad Saif, a known business person. And then also George Sabra, who's the head of the Syrian National Council from a Christian background. And then you also have a secular feminist, Suhair al-Atasi. Many Syrians, when they look at this new leadership, feel that they represent them and that they have legitimacy on the ground because they recently came out of Syria and they are seen as inside opposition.
All right, thank you. Cengiz, of course, Turkey has been drawn into a couple of altercations with the Assad regime already. I wonder if you could give us a sense of how you see the flow in the region.
Well, let me just refer to what the President of Turkey, Abdullah Gül, has said just yesterday. When he was asked about how he sees the situation in Syria, he has said that, which I share, a catastrophe has befallen on the country, Syria. And Syria, in the sense we pronounce the word Syria, does not exist anymore. The Syria we used to have since its foundation following the World War I and being an independent state, a member of United Nations following the World War II, is no more there in the sense of the magnitude of human tragedy, the population exchanges and movements, and the damage done to the infrastructure of the country in the material sense, in the societal sense, in the spiritual sense. We are talking about a country of 22, 23 million people, of which more than 25 million is displaced. Only by a week ago, the refugees that poured into Turkey is over 150,000, to Lebanon even more, and Jordan even at the same scale with Turkey. So nearly, roughly between 500,000 to 1 million people are refugees, apart from those who are displaced within the country itself. And the regime in Damascus cannot able to control nearly roughly 70% of the countryside of Syria, and its main urban centers, Damascus and Aleppo, are battlegrounds between the opposition and the regime. So before this waves of the Arab awakening reach to Syria in the day March 15, 2011, we could never think that we can roll the film back to March 14, 2011. It's over. The Syria we used to know is over. And the question which we face in Turkey and everybody faces in all over the region and the world, what we know that the days of the regime is ended. Yet the paradox is the regime is in place in Damascus. So the question is when and how, what day we wouldn't see Bashar Assad reigning over Syria, and how it will be achieved, and what kind of a transition we will have if we will ever find Syria in place to reassemble a country. I think in the Western world there is one dimension or one aspect of Syria is not very much noticed. That is the Kurdish aspect of it. Syria is not a homogeneous Arab country as many used to think of. And following the developments after the war in Iraq, the year 2003, we have a Kurdish entity in Iraq, quasi-independent. One of its representatives is with us, Mr. Sefin Dizai. The Kurdistan regional government is in place in Iraq, and now the Syrian Kurds, roughly making up 10% of the population, the moment the regime collapses, will come up to the scene that would be demanding similar rights as their kinsmen have in Iraq. So they would be looking either for an autonomous Kurdish zone or federal Syria or an independent Syrian entity, which will have a bearing upon Turkey, a country having 50%, more than 50% of all the Kurds in the world, that the Turkish Kurds will not reconcile themselves a status less than their brethren in Iraq and in Syria. So Syria is more than Syria as it is, and at this very moment, the future looks very bleak, and we are facing a lot of uncertainties concerning the situation in Syria.
Let me ask you one follow-up question. You mentioned quite rightly that there's a Kurdish section of the Syrian population. So far, it has remained largely on the side of the armed conflict. Do you foresee a time? You mentioned that once the regime collapses, there will be demands for Kurdish autonomy or increased Kurdish autonomy. Do you see the Kurdish in Syria helping to defeat the Assad regime militarily?
They place themselves seemingly neutral because they haven't reconciled their differences with the Arab segment of the Syrian opposition. They want the Arab commitment for the future of Syria in terms of Kurdish rights. And in our part of the world, the concepts as federalism, autonomy, they are synonymous with dismemberment and fragmentation and partition. So Arabs, like Turks, are very allergic to such demands, and they want to see Syria, the opposition itself, even the Islamist component of the Syrian opposition itself, wants to see Syria continuing as an Arab country with some minority rights accorded to whomever the minority is. But as many things that the Kurdish movement has arrived historically, so the Kurds, they just put the bar higher than many would think, and so they don't reconcile yet with the Syrian opposition. But this doesn't necessarily mean that they are cooperating with the regime or not undertaking any efforts for the collapse of the regime. They are trying to control the areas they are populous or represented the majority of the population, inhabitants, and they are forming councils for their own self-rule. So it remains to be seen how the things will unfold, because whenever the Kurds demand something, it will involve Turkey's Kurdish question, and it will have an influence upon the Turkish position vis-a-vis Syria. So it's a bit complicated and complex. But for a snapshot, if we have, the Kurds do not look as active as their Arab compatriots in Syria in terms of fighting against the regime.
And of course, Turkey was one of two countries that has now officially recognized the council from Doha, France being the other one. Rahida, do you want to weigh in on the council perhaps and how you view the situation?
Well, I just would like to try to answer your original question, if I may, the larger picture of what may be going on. I want to say thank you for inviting me again this year. Last year I was in your position. And I'm a Lebanese citizen, an American citizen. I live in New York. I cover the United Nations. So that is the way I look at it from the larger regional and international approach. And whatever you want to think of what's going on in the region now, everyone is looking at Washington. What will the new president of the United States, what would be the president in the second term, do about any of what he promised to do? So let's look at the 3 Obama promises. The first promise was in his first term, when he said he will find a solution for the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And unfortunately, we know what happened over the 4 years. There has been a failure in that. So this was an unfulfilled promise at best, but some see it as a failed promise. The second promise that the President of the United States, unprecedented as it is, was when he said that the United States will never allow Iran to be a nuclear power. Now, this is unprecedented, whether right or wrong, but this is something that was done not only during the elections, but a statement made by the president more than once, and I think it was in connection of promises made also to the Israeli prime minister. How will President Obama fulfill this promise? Is he going to wiggle out of it? Is he going to absolutely implement it, whether it is militarily or through his containment policy? And what are the Israelis doing from my point of view? One of the reasons, or one of the fascinating parts about the Gaza operation is that, A, they're giving Hamas sort of a lead. The Israelis are giving Hamas sort of a lead in creating the new dynamics or dictating the new dynamics, including bringing in an alliance of the Muslim Brotherhood leaderships, be it in Egypt or Turkey or Qatar, around Hamas, in probably a deliberate move to undermine President Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, because he's going to the United Nations asking for a status of a state, observer state for the Palestinians. But the change of subject, at least by the Israelis, away from Iran and Syria onto Gaza, to me is a very fascinating development. Is it temporary, or is it going to be an ongoing? How long is that change of subject? Sometimes leaders and security people know better. They feel that they could have a contained escalation. Maybe that's what they have in mind. Is this doable? Does the word contained escalation work in this powder keg region that we live in? The third promise that President Obama has made, again, he never made any commitment to Syria, on Syria, except on the chemical weapons. Now, we understand right now that there is concern. The Pentagon suggested that there will be need of 70,000 troops in order to secure the chemical facilities in Syria in case there is any suspicious movement, be it by Hezbollah helping there, or by the jihadis taking over, or the regime using these chemical weapons. I mean, this is a big promise as well. What preparations have been made to fulfill that promise? I really don't know. I mean, I'd like somebody to help us with that answer. I think there is, again, eyes are always on Washington for leadership. Whether the United States wants to lead or not, the lack of, or the leading from behind becomes really a problem for the region and for the United States, because it can be dragged into a situation. I think the last meeting that took place in Cairo regarding Syria, I think it was the first meeting after the elections, American elections, and I think there was a very interesting development there because you had the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, with Europeans and with the United States, the trio started to say, all right, let's think of a strategy to help the coalition, the new coalition of Syria. And that means if the lip service is not good enough, they need help in a very substantial way. Arming is now on the table de facto, whether it's pronounced or not. Footing the bill is not a problem. The Arabs will do that. The Saudis, the United Arab Emirates, the Qataris will foot the bill. So, and nobody's talking about American troops on the ground there. So this is one most important development. And why is it very important? Because it is really now in terms of how will it be taken forward with Russia and China. Will there be a confrontation? The question that's going to be asked and needs to be asked, because a strategy is needed, to go to the Russians and say, basically, now what do you want? Now, you know, this president is there for 4 more years. We don't have to wait for the elections. We don't have to hide behind our finger. What is it that you want? Is it doable to give the Russians what they want or not? Is it Cold War that they want? Then what are the consequences of that? And from what I understand, maybe President Putin is given some sort of signals that he wants to talk, but from what I understand is when Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, was meeting with the Gulf ministers, the GCC ministers, from what my information is, he did not give in at all. They're standing exactly where they were. So I think a strategy is needed. Attrition is not a strategy. And I think the US, no matter how much we try to sort of run away from that situation in Syria and in Palestine and Israel, in Iran, it's light-footed or heavy-footed, a leadership is needed.
I have one follow-up question for you, and that's, do you see the current situation? You talked about the instability and how it's an opportunity to, as they say in America, change the channel. How likely is it also an opportunity for Assad to change the channel and get an engagement with Israel so that the world stops looking at what he's doing to his own people?
You see, you have to understand the Arab mindset and the Islamic mindset. Now that there is Gaza, all these sort of bickerings and animosities just are put aside. When it comes to Palestine, it is a unifying ground for Arabs and for Muslims. So I don't, again, the danger of changing the subject away from Syria is really, it's multiple faceted, but I don't think this will be an opportunity to strike a deal between the Syrian regime and Israel. There may be a deal already, but it's not about giving back the Golan Heights. And we could talk about the Golan Heights development a little more later, but I think the Israelis will have to decide, actually, what is it in their interest? Is it better to consider that these jihadists, if you will, are dangerous for them and they need to couple up with the regime or stay coupled up with the regime because they've been for a long time? Is that in their better interest? Or is it in their interest to actually understand that this regime is going at any point? Doesn't matter if it is in a month or in a year or two. And therefore, to hasten its downfall is really to cut short the escalation of these extremists and their empowerment. The jihadists will be weaker if this is done faster. The fact that they are there and strong is because there's been hesitation and procrastination.
Safine, do you want to, we've had a couple of discussions about sort of the Kurdistan aspect of the conflict. What would you like to contribute as far as the overall flow?
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter and other colleagues. Thank you for the invitation. It's good to be here. I think the Syrian regime has been expecting such developments for quite some time, especially after the regime change in Iraq. In fact, on several occasions when Iraqi former opposition groups, who some of them were actually based in Syria, and governing council members were on official visits or perhaps even on bilateral ties that they had originally with the Syrians and the Iranians. On such visits, they were asked who is next on the list. In fact, they were pretty sure that it's Iran and Syria, but who's first, whether it's going to be Iran or Syria. That was in the early days or months of the Iraqi war. However, as things started to look somewhat ugly in Iraq, I think they took, it was a sigh of relief for them, but they have been expecting that knock on the door for some time. Perhaps the events in North Africa has speeded up this process in a way to engulf Syria, or at least to promote such an idea of regime change in Syria. The developments in the last 2 years, if we can say, has been somewhat, one can call it the least, been a calamity, with all these killings of 35,000 lives being lost and the damages to the infrastructure. But unfortunately, the response, or at least the efforts of the opposition, or the support for the opposition, has not been matching the calamities or the wish and the desire of the Syrians for the change. This may be attributed to internal and external factors. Some were pointed out. There's certainly the Russian and the Iranian factor, but also the internal factor of the opposition. As it was mentioned very earlier, the first few months it was very peaceful demand of reforms, and it took months thereafter to be responded by heavy military exercises by the regime, which continues to this very day. The internal opposition, or the rebels, or the freedom fighters, and the political wings that mostly are abroad, there may well be no solid interaction between the two, and not a clear agenda so far. Yes, there has been meetings in Turkey, in other Arab countries, and more recently in Doha. Doha, or Qatar, as a small Gulf state, wants to play it big. It was a big event for them. But whether it is inclusive in the sense that all opposition figures and key figures within and outside are within that structure, I would say the formation of the new structure, it's probably either a premature birth, or perhaps even, I can say, a late delivery. Premature in the sense it is not that inclusive. Late delivery, 2 years of this destruction, and they have been able to come to this point, which is not quite satisfactory. Unless there's international intervention, such as what you had in Libya, with a no-fly zone and perhaps even arms support, I think this status quo will continue. And unfortunately, the Syrian people will continue to suffer. On the Kurdish front, which was asked a bit earlier, initially the Iraqi Kurdish leadership advised the Kurdish groups in Syria to be somewhat cautious and not to spearhead any developments or changes. For one reason, perhaps, this could have easily been manipulated by the regime to accuse the Kurds, and as always, the second Israel, and so on and so forth. So it was very, I think, a wise move to be in touch with opposition groups, but at the same time, to be engaged at a time when things have moved on. To an extent, they have been able to control certain areas which was abandoned by the Syrian security and the military apparatus. But at the same time, they took part in many opposition meetings and gatherings. However, they were reluctant to continue to be part of that due to the very fact that the opposition did not have a very clear agenda or strategy or a roadmap, not only for the Kurdish issue, but for the future Syria as a whole. Yes, democracy is a fine thing, but it ends there. And without having that clear strategy and a roadmap, I think we will be going around this vicious circle for some time to come. On the issue of the Kurds and the concerns that Turkey has, I think these concerns, as far as if you look at it from Turkish angle, is genuine. With 20 million Kurds in Turkey and with the Kurds in Iraq for the last 20 years or so being ruling themselves, naturally the Kurds in Turkey would seek similar demands. However, the circumstances of Turkey is different to that of Iraq and different to that of Syria. The area, border area with Turkey, which is almost 900 kilometers, and there are large pockets that have been controlled by the Kurds at the moment, Turkey has expressed concern over the dominance of PKK in that area, and particularly a group called PYD, which is known or thought to be close to PKK. But apart from that, there are many moderate Kurdish groups who are on the scene, and I believe Turkey can reach out to them and to operate and to coordinate, because anything may happen. And 100 years ago, we saw major developments in the Middle East after the First World War, and here we are at that very same critical point. There may well be changes in the region, political changes, perhaps, dare I say, border changes. So I think in any eventuality, the people of the region, the key players, the key actors must be ready. What I can say very briefly, Syria is a serious business. You sort of left the border thing for the end of the conversation there. It's obviously the most contentious, but obviously the heart's desire of most Kurds is to be reunited. Give me a sense of how close the relationship is between Kurds in northern Iraq. I mean, what kind of information is flowing to the Kurds in Syria right now? Obviously, lessons learned in what happened in Iraq. Is there a mentorship going on? Is there high-level, constant communication, or how much of the conversation is happening within Kurds across boundaries? Well, definitely there is affinity for our Kurdish brethren, be it in Iran, Turkey, or Syria. I think it's very natural. But I think the Iraqi Kurdish leadership have been very cautious not to be seen that they're intervening directly in the internal affairs of our neighbors. However, we have not hidden our thoughts that we would like to see the Kurds to enjoy their democratic rights in each of those countries that they live in. With the Kurds of Syria, yes, there has been and there are still serious contacts, especially with the moderate groups. There are 15 or 16 different political groups in Syria, Kurdish groups. They have held conferences, and President Barzani was instrumental in getting them together. Not only that, but also to get them to sign a pact with the PYD. Unfortunately, PYD has not been honoring that agreement, but these contacts are there, and there are almost 40,000 Syrian nationals, Kurds and non-Kurds, who have fled Syria, and they are actually living in Iraqi Kurdistan right now. Okay, so let me see if I can recap so we can move on to the next section. It seems to be agreement here anyway that there's a stalemate in Syria right now. And as you said, there's a little bit of disagreement on the level of maturity of the coming together of the opposition. And there's also been some discussion about what's required for Western, NATO, American intervention. So let's move to the what-if aspect of what we're talking about now, and let's move to the idea of military intervention, because at this point, I think it's pretty clear that the West, NATO, United States, has determined it's not in their national interest to get involved in the Syrian conflict. I'd like each of you to think about at what point does it become in their national interest, and if it does, what's the most effective thing happening going forward? Do you want to start?
Many Syrians have begun to compare their situation to that of Bosnia. It took the international community a long time to intervene, and I think it was more of a shamed into a situation when in a population of 5 million, when you had 200,000 being ethnically cleansed. I think that put the international community in a very difficult position, and they had to intervene. So what is happening in Syria is that you have a civilian population and you have a regime that is waging a full-scale war and is fully armed, and you have you have a population that is trying to defend itself with small arms and increasingly bigger arms, because as the soldiers are defecting and generals, they're bringing with them arms. We met some of the representatives of the Free Syrian Army in Doha, and some of them actually confided in us that perhaps they don't even need to be armed, that the arm supply is coming from within as people defecting from the army. So I think that is a security threat, not just for the neighboring countries, but for also a civilian population that is becoming increasingly caught between two sides that are fighting. And now the Free Syrian Army is no longer doing the defense job, because, as I said earlier, now they want to create some sort of a strategic plan in which they cut the supplies off the regime forces, and so they're taking over certain areas, sometimes to the opposition of some of the local population. I've had this happen to my own family and the relatives and families of many members in the Syrian opposition, where Free Syrian Army forces enter certain areas and declare them liberated, and then the regime forces come and shell these areas. However, when you talk to the people, even if they're opposed to the strategies of the Free Syrian Army, they're still more aligned with the Free Syrian Army than with the Syrian regime forces. For example, I heard that there's some looting happening in some areas, and when I asked the locals who's doing that, they were shocked that I would even ask. They said the Free Syrian Army, even if we disagree with their strategies and the way they're doing things, generally they protect the civilian population, and there are sometimes accidents, but the regime forces systematically are trying to subjugate the civilian population. So this situation, I think you have now Syrians caught up between two sides, where one side was weak but is increasingly getting stronger. There were reports yesterday that they were able to get some supplies of anti-aircraft missiles, the Free Syrian Army. So, I mean, with the increased amount of supplies coming from within, I mean, that is also creating a new situation.
And go ahead.
No, I just was going to do the what-if scenario that you suggested. Let's just play it a little bit. So what if President Bashar al-Assad wakes up tomorrow and decides, well, you know, it's a good thing for me to step down now. That's not going to happen. So let's just put the impossible scenarios out of the question. What if the Iranian regime, the Iranian government decides that, you know, Syria is no longer the linchpin for me, because the survival of the Syrian regime is essential for Iran. And you know, there's been a lot of focus on the jihadists who maybe less than 10% in support, working actively militarily in Syria, but Iran as a state has been defying Security Council resolutions that prevented under Chapter 7 from extending military aid to Syria or anywhere else for that matter, to Hezbollah, whatever. And it has been, you know, sort of boasting about it. My understanding is that they even have pilots, Iranian pilots, operating in Syria. They are not hiding their absolute commitment to that ally. And yet no one has moved in the Security Council, not the Americans, not the British, not the French, to say, we need to stop that. So the Iranian role in Syria is huge. It's for them existentialist almost, because it is their connection with Hezbollah as well. So that what if Iran is going to change its mind is not happening. Then the big what if is, what about the neighbors? What's going to happen for the neighbors? This is a likelihood. Before I do the neighbors, though, what if Russia changes its mind? Now, that is a variable. What does it take? It takes that necessary conversation.
And is there an opening for Russia in the vacuum?
Well, I mean, after the
American
elections,
leadership?
yes, absolutely. Yeah. Right now, I think this is the time to go back to the table, reshuffle the cards, and say, is there an opportunity? I mean, again, I don't think that it's not. Okay, I know it's happened, and it's containment, and let me out of this, and I'll wait till attrition takes its place, and you know what happens if it is the Bosnia example, the Afghan example, you know, as long as I'm out of it. But it's just not. It is still an opportunity for discussion amongst big powers and regional powers as what needs to be done now. That conversation must be had. And if Russia says to the United States, listen, and to the Gulf states, by the way, to the GCC countries, My option is the following. I'm going to stick to demanding that Bashar al-Assad stays detrimental and most important in that transition, in that political transition they're talking about. If they're not going to budge on Bashar al-Assad, period, and if they're going to say, my alliance is really with Iran, that will have to change the dynamics, because the GCC and Iran are, of course, right, I mean, there's the option of Syria is the linchpin. I mean, Syria can break the backbone of Iran rather than the United States going to do to weaken Iran with the military strike that President Obama does not want to do anyway. So in a way that the option becomes strike Iran or weaken it through Syria. And weaken Hezbollah as well. So which brings me to the regional equation. I mean, look what's happening in Jordan today. It's dangerous. It's very, very dangerous what's going on. What's happening in Lebanon, the escalation goes on. If you had watched the statements by Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, last week, you would know escalation the decision has been taken to escalate. The whole region is in the mode, is put on escalate, escalate, escalate. So that what if things get out of control? I mean, you may tell me, no, the new leadership in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood are wise enough. They take their time because they're not rash. They're not going to enter into a war with Israel. I say you're right. I don't think they will. But when you push too much, what happens? Bashar al-Assad was lucky that there happened to be American elections. So everybody hid behind each other. The third triple veto in the Security Council with Russia and China saved him. He is banking on Iran all the time. And now he's being lucky enough that there is a change of subject. He's been dying to do that in Lebanon and everything else. And now Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu is doing it for him in Gaza. So he's been a lucky guy.
All right. Yeah, Rahida just made a really good point here that I want to use to jump off to the audience here. And that is, we're living in a time of escalation, escalation, escalation. Do you have a question? Microphones? Go ahead. Just stand up and shout it out.
Is that this actually is a security issue. We saw research come out last year that said that the single biggest predictor of a state's level of security is not its wealth, its GDP, its level of democratization, its ethno-religious affiliation. It's the way that it treats its women, and that even democracies that have high levels of violence against women are less stable than non-democracies that don't. And so the reason I ask this is that we've seen time and again that we can't rely on the parties to the conflict to ensure that women are involved in formal processes. In Yemen and in various other parts of the Arab Spring, we saw that women's rights were indeed the first thing that were negotiated away and sort of agreed upon as a confidence-building measure that they would not need to be included in formal negotiations. And in the past 30 years, I think 2% of the people who've signed formal peace agreements have been women. So harkening back to yesterday about the old normal and the current normal, and I fear the future normal, is that women are playing, significant dramatic roles in uprisings and in revolutions, and then excluded when it comes time to the formal process.
So your question is?
So my question is, what can we actually do at this point to signal support for women in Syria, in various other parts, countries that are undergoing similar situations? I know some of this relates to long-term support, but what are the tools that we have as an international community right now to both not do harm and inflict backlash, but to indicate that this is something that we are actually serious about, something we want to see, and something that we, with our financial support and political leverage, can actually make a difference on? Thank you.
I guess it's for the women on the panel.
Well,
or Cengiz as well. I mean, it's a pluralistic state.
But I could start, because I think many people are not aware of some of the internal dynamics of the Syrian National Council. And to be fair, many of the men were supportive of the women, and we had almost 3 women who almost made it to the General Secretariat. They were only missing 1 voice. What happened, and I guess that's why there's the science of electoral design. Really, the results depend on the way you design the elections. And so the elections were designed around voting for small entities where you needed only 8 voices to actually be elected to the General Secretariat. So if you got 7 voices, that was not enough. So what happened is that during the day, I, for example, kept holding my vote because I was trying to make sure that minorities also get elected. And many people were just excited about the election process. As Syrians, they were yearning to cast their votes, and they had cast their votes in the morning. And then they started to realize we have quite a big gap in terms of representation of minorities and women. By the afternoon, not many voices and not many voices were left. So we were frantically trying to create the balance, and we couldn't really hit it. I have to admit that I've been approached several times to move up to the General Secretariat and even to the Executive Office. However, because I do not represent always the mainstream of where the revolution has been heading, I kept declining because I wanted Syrian people to see people who are more representative of their demands in this phase of the revolution. In the early phase, I was more upfront because the nonviolence movement was also in the front row when it came to organizing and mobilizing. So really, I mean, it's not as simple as it sounds. We increased the participation of women in the Syrian National Council. In the new coalition, there's an emphasis on participation of women. And it's also not a secular and Islamist when it comes to feminist issues. There are Islamist activists who are more interested in minority representation and feminist issues like Muaz al-Khatib, and there are some secular forces that are not bothered by these issues. So I think, you know, once you get to know the people, it's not as clearly as stereotyped as it appears in the media. It's a bit more complicated.
Yeah, Afra, but that's not true. What the lady said is absolutely right. Once they are in power, we women get neutralized or marginalized and pushed out. It is, you know, women have always been part of the struggle, but once they take power, it's already over with. And take a look, also the other element is that when the Muslim Brotherhood arose in Arab countries, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, etc., the West, some sectors of the West, Europe and the United States had this love fest with the Muslim Brotherhood, like they are the moderate Islam, and they are, you know, all of a sudden embrace them, and all of a sudden the secularists were marginalized. All of us, we were just like, you know, we were like, you know, you lost, you didn't matter. And the worst thing is that they called us the secularists. They said we were part of that regime, that we were really instrumental in the revolution to bring down. So all of a sudden, it was okay to compromise women's rights. You're absolutely right. All of a sudden, it became a lip service that it's paid to women, and there was no action taken. I think quota is one thing that is absolutely necessary. I think guarantees you know, that there will be no monopoly of power, because that's exactly what's happening in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood want it all. They are really patient. They know how to do building block. And then really put women up as a national security issue. Women just, you know, it's half the population. It's not only about the economy, it is really about the national security also of the region. And I think that the Western countries have really, I mean, you know, women, youth. When it comes right down to interests, it's all out of the window.
Cengiz, your country's had some experience in this, a little ahead of the curve maybe.
Yeah, I don't want to go into detail on gender issues, seemingly, that we are just getting into, but I just wanted to bring into your attention that compared to other opposition movements in the Muslim world, the Syrian opposition has fairly better sense of women representation in its political structure and leadership. If we recall, Basma Kodmani, who happened to be the spokeswoman of the Syrian National Council in its early stages now, that is replaced in Doha by a new one.
Rima Flihan.
Very, very, very long name, by the way. Coalition of Revolutionary Forces and Syrian Opposition, which means it will not survive. the name has to change at least, so that there can't be such a thing.
The coalition
but
now.
yet,
Maybe their new female spokesperson could help them shorten it and make it briefer. Because they also have a women representative.
Yeah, I just wanted to underline that the vice president of this new body of opposition, Suhair Attasi, a very credible and secular national Syrian figures. These will not resolve a very legitimate intervention from the floor, but still, in that sense, Syria brings more hopeful prospects for us compared with the other.
All right. I'd just like to move on to another question, if I can, sir.
My name is Glenn Davidson. I was the ambassador of Canada to Syria until March of this past year. I arrived there in summer of 2008 in the honeymoon period. I watched things develop. I developed a great affection, a great fondness for the country, for the traditions of coexistence and tolerance which have marked the country and which are generally little known in the West. The recent change in the opposition presents an opportunity, and I think this has been what's most terribly missing over the past year and a half. And I think that there's an opportunity now, a window of opportunity. And I would suggest that the point that was made about the fact that this will not stop as long as the Assads are in power is exactly right. And there should be no illusion about that. I would say that in addition to that, when you look at the reasons they're still in power, it's not through popular support base across the country. There is support and fear of the regime, which keeps the security forces and keeps the army on their side. The window of opportunity I see right now is for the new coalition to look at this, to look at the weakened position of the government, and to look at what can be done to weaken the support of the security forces and the military. They will fear, the security forces and the military will fear the inevitable cycle of revenge and retribution. That should be addressed. And I would suggest that the coalition needs to do what's really hard, and which is to be very bold, look out, offer the olive branch, and make representation to the security forces, to the army, and yes, those that have committed terrible crimes will need to be held accountable. But the rank and file soldiers, the rank and file security forces, need to have a place in the new Syria. I suggest that's an opportunity. The longer this goes on, the more that will diminish. But I think it's a very important opportunity. Thank you.
And then do you believe that we should arm that group, that this group is the kind of organization that gives us more confidence that if we arm it to a higher degree, that it will have the desired outcome?
I want to stay clear of the whole issue of arming. I mean, it's very easy to talk about solutions to draw on past examples. I hear talk of no-fly zones, I hear talk of foreign intervention, drawing on earlier models. What I'm suggesting is look at the hard solution, the internal solution, where the people themselves can set the stage for peace, not make it worse.
Safine, do you want to comment on that? Because you thought that the rising opposition group was a little young yet to take that kind of responsibility.
Consolation pass to the lady who asked the question. You can be sure the ladies are in control of this panel. That is a consolation. Well, I think from what Mr. Ambassador said, external intervention, you can look at it in a different way, in a positive and a negative way, to assist the opposition in order to push its agenda, which is for liberation, freedom, the road to democracy, fine. But there are times when it's been viewed in a negative way, that imposing ideas from outside. I think the Syrian people should be the ones to decide what their future should look like. How are you going to do it? Is the mechanism that is in place right now sufficient? Personally, I don't think so. I think...
what would it take?
There has been such examples in the past of meetings and conferences and gatherings, and each one tries to have this conference on their own patch in order to address some of their own concerns, whether it is Qatar, whether it is Turkey, or any other country for that matter. So I think there should be more independency of the opposition and not so much influenced by outside forces, be it regional or elsewhere, in order to have a clear vision, to have a clear agenda, to have a clear strategy to address all issues. It's been going on for 2 years, and I think there has been sufficient time to have some clarity on how the future Syria should look like. And it should reflect the will, the wish, and the desire of the population inside.
And so you're taking your lesson from Libya, where the opposition was a little more advanced, a little more cohesive before there was intervention?
Well, that was 2 years ago when it started, but has Libya been a story of success? There's still a good degree of violence going on. I think a different formula. Each country differs from another. I think the Syrian society, with all due respect to other societies, including Libyans, but I think the Syrian society culturally probably is more advanced, developed, and I think they, especially with the case of women, I don't think the Syrians have this sensitivity about women playing a role as such.
Let's keep the questions going, sir. Yep. We have 5 minutes, by the way, everybody.
My question is to Radiga Durkheim about Russia's possible reaction. You mentioned the what-if scenario. Since you are covering UN, what is your feeling in case of no-fly zone over Syria or other kind of military intervention? How Russia may react, or will it react? And in particular, what about South Caucasus, where Georgia is an issue, Trans-Caspian is an issue, other important issues?
There is no sign so far right now that when things come to the Security Council that Russia is going to budge. There is an attempt after the Cairo meeting, the trilateral agreement, European, American, Arab, that they will move on to the United Nations probably next week or the week after with the idea of getting a Chapter 7 resolution. That would be quite basic, but if it starts with ceasefire and right to demonstrate, the regime in Damascus is not going to implement that. And it seems to me that Russia is not going to allow it unless something happens between now and the time it goes to the Security Council at the level of that larger conversation I'm talking about between the two leaderships, US and Russia. If such a conversation starts, and there could be a possibility of that grand bargain, but it's also the clarity that is needed is becoming more urgent, because if there is a decision to go to the Security Council with a draft resolution that will take a fourth veto, that is really a serious decision. It's not only about the Russians, it's also about the West deciding to do that too. I think the Russians have succeeded in neutralizing one very important tool in their hand, which is the Security Council. I mean, this is where they mattered. This is where Vladimir Putin really says, this is my power too. And he succeeded in neutralizing it, which brings us to the Cairo meeting again. What are the other options? What if, what does it take, as Kevin said? Well, basically, it's going to take NATO to say to Turkey, we're fine. You're going to have to do this. It's going to have to happen outside of the Security Council. The Russians would have served, the ambassador, the Russians had a very important role, and they should have, could have, and may still be able to play in Syria, because they had connections with the military hierarchy there, and they could influence the developments on that level, on the local level, if you will. If they make the deal, if they agree to something, yes, they will play a constructive role. But as it stands right now, Russia is part of an axis in Syria. Bashar al-Assad regime, Hezbollah Lebanon, Iran, Russia, and to a lesser extent, China. It's an axis. Don't kid yourself about it. And I think Mr. Putin is very determined to say, this is my way. Now, maybe President Obama should also look at what can the United States give to the Russians in the region. Is it okay to give them, I mean, it is about give and take. I think, personally, if they wanted a foothold in Tartus, let them have it, personally. But I think the conversation is about something much larger in the bilateral relationship. Unfortunately, I hate to say it so bluntly, but it is quite distressing, to say the least, that the leadership in Russia feels that it wants to regain its might and its superpowerdom at the expense of the children and the women and the fighters, freedom fighters in Syria. This is a very unfortunate matter, but this is the way I guess it's looking now.
Cengiz, I know you want to talk about that, but I have one quick question for you.
Very briefly, what I feel that the issue of Russia in terms of the Syrian crisis is treated out of proportion. We just always hear emphasizing the importance of Russia, the role it plays via UN Security Council. It didn't neutralize the UN Security Council. It made the whole UN body dysfunctional, actually, Russia. But it's more of the Western reluctance in terms of taking a clear position vis-a-vis Syria than the role Russia is playing. Because if we speak of an axis of Russia with Bashar al-Assad regime, with Hezbollah, with Iran, we have to recall that the Russian commitment and connection to Serbia was much more stronger in the days of Kosovo and Bosnia. And both in Bosnia and Kosovo, the intervention, the intervention of the international community, meaning US plus EU, came outside the mechanism of UN. There was no Security Council resolution endorsing the intervention to Bosnia or to Kosovo. So in Syria, the Libya case is irrelevant because of a variety of reasons, which Sefin did not want to touch upon, just confined himself saying that each country has different historical context and topography and geopolitics and so on. The Iraqi example is also irrelevant for Syria. But Kosovo and Bosnia is much more valid compared to the others. Yet, the problem is not the hurdle that Russia brings up on the Western world. It's the clarity or non-clarity of the Western world vis-a-vis Syria. The last thing I just want to add that for a while when, as yesterday pointed out, for Obama's position of, what was it, light footprints approach, that Kofi Annan brought a great benefit to this American approach to hide it itself behind it. And now we have this Lakhdar Brahimi mission. They are both doomed to failure. Annan proved to be a failure from the very outset. So will the case with Brahimi, which are both UN undertakings. The simple reason is that the starting point, the ultimate the aim of all these two UN stamped missions are bringing legitimacy to the regime, while the regime is defunct and has to be removed.
All right, we have run out of time, and obviously, you know, we made a crack anyway in getting a better understanding of what's going on. I think it's only fair to say, a friend of mine's Roland Paris, there you are, Roland, but he said yesterday that he's teaching in Paris right now, and that his, he's basically telling a student that everything that happens over the next few months is going to be studied for many, many years from now. That, you know, all the main players are facing tests right now. Civilians are dying in that test, and the power balance is shifting under our feet, and nobody knows where it's going to end up, of course. So thank you all, panel, for your time. Thank you for your contributions. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much. Just before you go, as a courtesy, let's have a round of applause for Kevin Newman for taking us through a very complicated subject. Thank you very much. And please, if you possibly could be back here at 10:15 sharp for the next session, which is on China.